Hello and welcome to another Retro Island Diskettes, the show where we abandon a guest on Retro Island. And Andrew, this is our 5th episode of the podcast and nobody's objected to being marooned by us just yet. Do you think they know something about Retro Island that we don't?
Well, what's not to like, Neil? I mean, it's free of social media and reality TV shows, so it sounds pretty good to me. I don't wish to alarm anybody, but today we're in danger of learning something new because not only is our guest a huge fan of retro video games, but knows a little thing or two about what goes on under the hood.
Indeed, and he's going to share these experiences with us through 8 music tracks of his choosing. Today's guest has worked on some of the most recognisable titles out there in the modern gaming world, before embarking on a challenging new Kickstarter project to write a game for the good old Sega Megadrive.
And that game is called Tanglewood, and our guest is Matt Phillips. Welcome to the island.
Hey, how's it going?
Before we really get to know you, Matt, why don't you get us all in the mood with your first choice of tune?
Yep, sure thing. This is from my PlayStation 1 days. It's a game called Skull Monkeys. I mean, it had a soundtrack called 1970s Disco Fever. The soundtrack's by Terry Scott Taylor and is one of my favourite games of all time. It's a claymation game about a guy with 3 nipples with a flapping anus on his head who sings songs about beans. So to a teenager at the time, that very much appealed to me. It was a great game in its own right, even without the humour shoved in there. Excellent 2D platformer. But the thing that really stuck with me was the soundtrack. If you imagine Monty Python wrote a video game, and you're halfway there.
A brilliant track by the equally brilliant Terry Scott Taylor, who had been behind a lot of great video game music over the last 20 years. Matt, if I remember correctly, this was a claymation style game. Is that what attracted you to it?
Yeah, that was part of the deal. I was one of those kids who was always picking up games and books and judging them by their covers right there in the shop. Not the best of habits to get into, but this one was really shiny, so I picked it up and had a look. And yeah, I don't think I'd ever seen a claymation game before that. I'd seen all sorts of claymation animation. I was a big fan of TV shows and cartoons at the time that were doing similar things. I loved that sort of stuff and I loved that kind of style. To see it in a game for the first time was something that really struck a chord with me.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of some myself. I'm thinking Trapdoor. Would that's
yeah, Trapdoor, a door Trapdoor. Absolutely loved that. I've recently bought the DVD box set of Trapdoor.
What is his name, that blue guy?
Burke, yeah. And him upstairs.
What about in your neighbourhood, Matt? Whereabouts in the country were you growing up?
A town called Whitchurch, North Shropshire. A small village. There weren't many people around. If I wanted any kind of social life, I had to ask my parents to drive me into town. So I got quite a lot of personal time to sort of sit and tinker with computers and play games and listen to music, practicing drums at the time as well. So I got quite a lot of time to myself living out the country with nobody else there.
So while you were smashing buttons on your PlayStation, were you a fan of the previous generation consoles or microcomputers?
Yeah, it certainly was. First system I got was the Commodore 64, and I did a mixture of playing games on that and learning to program. At some point I had a NES. The Megadrive followed very shortly after that, and that's the one that stuck with me since. That was very much my favourite console.
Is it fair to say your first game that you ever programmed would have been on the Commodore 64 then?
Yes, it probably was. I wish I'd kept some of the tapes. I think there are even games that I'd written before I figured out how to save my work onto tape, so there were some that existed for a few hours, then disappeared into nowhere.
Can you remember anything that you programmed on the C64 that made you particularly proud, that really stands out in your memory?
There are a couple of things. I remember the first listing I finished typing out, which was a little moving sprite of a hot air balloon with the Commodore logo in the middle. That took my dad and I hours to flick through the pages to figure out where we'd gone wrong, because once you typed it all in, you had to then go back through it all and figure out where your commas and full stops had gone wrong or which numbers were incorrect. I made a small text adventure. I don't really remember much of the content. I was very young. I think I did that in a language within a program called DBase 3, which was my dad's accounting software for his work. So it wasn't even a gaming programming language I made that one in. It was just on his Amstrad PC at work.
Brilliant. It's like writing a game in SQL.
Yeah, pretty much. Have you seen those Excel spreadsheet games? Some of those are really impressive. I think from then on I did some Windows programming, and that would have been with a language called Dart Basic, which was the DirectX version of Basic. I absolutely adored the thing.
So were you an active member of the Dark Basic forums sharing your work, or was it a solitary hobby for you?
I remember the forums very well. I don't think I ever shared anything because I didn't really have anything worth contributing at that point. So many people had reused the same assets for some things that were far more impressive than I was doing. But it's definitely a learning experience, and I certainly had the right people around when things went wrong and I needed advice.
Well, little did they know what you would become in later years. On that note, would you like to introduce us to your next track, Matt?
Yeah, okay. My second track, Toe Jam and Earl's Rapmaster Rocket Racket. I first heard this track in the Menacer gun minigame, Toe Jam and Earl's Ready Aim Tomatoes. It was also the first time I'd ever heard PCM played back in a game. It had the line, good shooting, not, at the end if you did really badly. It's very quirky, it's very funky, and I really liked stuff like this from very early on.
Well, I really love this track. I think this is probably a candidate for the funkiest video game track ever made, and I don't think it would have sounded as good on anything other than the Mega Drive sound chip. You told us just then that you first heard the Toe Jam and Earl track in a minigame you played with the Menacer light gun on your Mega Drive. For anyone who hasn't seen a Menacer, can you describe it for us?
Yeah, it was a big, over-the-top, attitude-driven light gun. It had all sorts of attachments that came with it, like different handles, various scopes you could detach and things like that. It looked like a giant bazooka.
Well, Neil knows all about Sega peripherals that get bolted onto TVs.
Yes, I have the Sega Video Driver, which is a VHS tape with a physical car on like a train track that you put in front of the television, and it has to detect a white bar at the bottom of the VHS video. Yeah, that was an interesting one. I mean, the Menacer doesn't have a great reputation, but that certainly has a worse one.
I think you could be right. But just back to Toe Jam and Earl, for me, I think it's a bit of a forgotten title because shortly after its release, Sega released the amazing Streets of Rage, and a few months later than that, Sonic. Do you think this marked the beginning of a new golden era for Sega?
I suppose so, yes. I only remember the two eras of Mega Drive, and that was pre-Sonic and post-Sonic. I guess you could call post-Sonic era the golden era. Maybe the quality of the titles just increased because more people were buying the machine. More developers were on board for making games for the machine.
Do you think now could be the time for a Toe Jam and Earl comeback? Would they fit in modern day gaming?
I think the developers pop up now and again on Twitter. In fact, just bear with me. Wasn't there a planned Kickstarter for one? Yep, there we go. Toe Jam and Earl back in the groove. Yeah, that got $500,000. So there you go. Toe Jam and Earl is coming back.
$500,000. There's a huge demand for it then. It's not just me that wants to see more Toe Jam and Earl.
$500,000 gets you a new remake of Toe Jam and Earl.
So yeah, you want your Toe Jam and Earl resurgence. There it is.
So Matt, before we step out of your childhood and into your university years, can you introduce us to your next track?
Yes, indeed. It's Flying Battery Zone Act 2 from Sonic 3. And I genuinely don't think they write bass lines like this anymore. I've got a very good friend who's currently working on Star Citizen called Glenn Neal, and we go way back. And we would talk for hours on MSN Messenger, sending links to tracks from the Genesis with the best bass lines. And it was quite a long list we came up with. I think this track's right at the top though.
Great composition there from a time where Sega started piling in the composers for the various tunes. I believe there are at least 9 in that game. And one of our earlier guests, DJ Slopes, mentioned that Michael Jackson was allegedly involved at the time. Do you feel titles fare better when handled by single coders or composers as opposed to by committee?
It depends. I've seen it go well either way. I think if a single composer has a vision and wants to keep the soundtrack consistent throughout the game, I think that's usually better off than, too many cooks spoils the broth kind of situation. I've certainly seen games go either way.
I guess it takes quite a lot of people to make a game either way, so there's always a lot of people involved, isn't there?
Yeah, even if you're making a game alone, there's always external influences involved. There's always people you run things past. Even if there's only one composer on the team, I'm sure somebody somewhere will have some input about its direction or small tweaks to make or tell them this track isn't quite right. So yeah, even working solo, you're not quite solo.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, Matt, but I think you went to university and studied a degree in computing and video games. Is that correct?
Yeah, it was a BSc Honours in Computer and Video Games at University of Salford.
And did you face any opposition or any kind of negativity when you chose a video game-based university degree?
There was a tricky conversation with my dad, put it that way. I remember trying to choose the GCSEs that I was going to take, and I wanted to do art and music because games involved art and music, and you could forget about any kind of programming course back in the day. Those didn't really exist. And yeah, I had to sit down with him and talking through the pros and cons of approaching a career in something like this. And his argument was that video games were a fad and they weren't going to be around in a couple of years. And of course, at the time, nobody knew if that was true or not. So he kind of half had a point, really. But I'd always wanted to go into games for as far back as I remember. Probably since the Megadrive, actually. I thoroughly enjoyed making games on the Commodore 64. I thoroughly enjoyed playing games on the Megadrive. The two loves sort of came together very early on. So yeah, I'd always wanted to make games.
I understand from speaking to youngsters that some university courses no longer get down and dirty and deal with the hardware. I can't imagine a computer course where students don't learn about CPU instructions and registers. Did yours start with the basics?
No, it didn't. Computer science was something I sort of had to learn on my own when I started Megadrive coding. Our course was more geared towards high-level stuff. It was still C++, so it was a sort of a middle ground. We learned things like initializing graphics drivers, drawing 2D shapes, texturing, things like that. I think eventually we learned 3D modeling and how to get models into game, and then audio, stuff like that. I think we eventually fit it together into our own game engine. So I certainly learned enough to start in the AAA industry, because I managed to bag a job at Traveller's Tales almost immediately out of university.
I fire up something like Unity, and I'm just blown away thinking this is not programming. It's so alien to the sort of programming that I would have grown up with and the things I'd have written that I can hardly even understand how people get started in it.
It's certainly programming by definition, whether you're using a graphical environment to create logical structures or program flows. The techniques are certainly transferable. If you learn to code traditionally with a couple of days with a graphical tool, I'm sure you can figure your way around. And vice versa, it's a great introduction to traditional programming if you start with graphical interfaces like that. But I think it eventually all boils down to elitist arguments that need to disappear, really. There are some certain cons to the debugging environment for these graphical tools. When you get a hard to reproduce or a hard to fix bug, I certainly prefer going back to basics and having code to step through. But that's not to say some tools are going to be improved in the future to help debug things like that just as easily it is to debug traditional code. But at the end of the day, the end user doesn't care. The players playing the games, the ones that are paying for all this, really don't care what was used to make the game.
So you would recommend that route to anyone else who's interested in the video games industry, do you think?
I do and I don't. Things have certainly changed since I was there. Was it over 10 years ago now? There are a lot more resources online to be able to pick up this sort of stuff yourself. There are a lot better tools, better engines, a lot more support from first-party developers as well. You can join the Xbox development program and turn your own Xbox One into your own development kit now. So yeah, I certainly would have recommended it back then. I'm not sure about now. I think it might be easier for somebody to just jump into something specialised, maybe a computer science course with a games development module on the side. Obviously, I haven't been to university for quite a while, so I don't really know. But it certainly looks like things are changing, and the entry points into the games industry might be a little different now.
Well, we're going to find out lots more about what you did after your university degree. But before that, why don't you introduce us to track format?
Yeah, this one's from the Scott Pilgrim original soundtrack for the game. I had the Xbox 360 version. It was something I got a lot of hours out of. I used to play co-op with my friends. Absolutely fantastic side-scrolling beat-em-up. Imagine a cutesy Streets of Rage. Say what you will about the film, but this was one of the most amazing 2D beat-em-ups experience I've played since the 90s.
That's a really nice chiptune inspired track from the game Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, and that was released in 2010. So Matt, at this time you'd finished up at uni. Did you walk into a degree related job for a large salary, as we're all promised?
I certainly walked into a degree related job. I'm not entirely sure about the latter part. I took what I could get, really. Yeah, it was great. As a fresh graduate, I think I did very well. I worked for Traveller's Tales. I worked on I think it was 13 Lego games I worked on during my time there. Everything from Lego Indiana Jones 2 up until Lego The Hobbit. And that was a fantastic place to work. I really enjoyed myself. It was a mixture of old school and new school coders, so the code base was quite a wonder to behold, really. A bit of a mash of old code versus new code. I think the engine they had at the time, they'd in production since the PS2. So I had various updates over the years, lots of platforms to work with as well. I think they released the Lego games on almost every platform available. So I got fairly chunky dev kits on my desk, quite a lot of equipment. Because I think at one point I had every dev kit that we were shipping on one desk. That kind of stuff made me really happy. So I had quite a broad experience learning to code across different platforms at Traveller's Tales.
And of course, Traveller's Tales was founded by John Burton, whose first ever game was Leander way back in 1991. And you mentioned the company also worked on the Sonic the Hedgehog games, Lego games, Crash Bandicoot as well. Did you ever have an opportunity to work with John Burton, or was he sunning himself on a beach somewhere?
I didn't have much opportunity to work with John directly. He certainly wasn't sunning himself on a beach somewhere, though he was a very busy guy, making deals with big companies and IPs and things, trying to get the next Lego franchises sorted. So he was rarely in his office. I did get a couple of nice chats with him, though, mostly about bugs that we were trying to fix in the current games we were writing, unfortunately. But no, there were other veteran Mega Drive programmers at the company at the time, so I did get to have some lengthy chats with some of the coders there who had worked on the likes of Sonic 3D and Toy Story, Mickey Mania, games like that. So I did get my fill of chatting to original coders back there for the Mega Drive.
So Matt, as you're sort of talking about all these games and working on them, is it true to say that working on games isn't always doing the amazing fun stuff of writing code? Did you have to do a lot about managing software and checking in your code into repositories, things like that?
Yeah, there's a whole bag of tricks that we covered briefly in university, but I don't think they quite stress the importance of these kind of things until you actually get to work in the industry. Working with source control is one big thing. You will do a lot. You'll also have conflicting changes with other coders you'll need to work out, so you'll need to learn how to merge and things like that. That's really tricky when you're approaching it for the first time. Bug tracking software, I think we used Jira at the time. That's not something we worked with at university either. It was mentioned in passing that companies might use bug tracking software. Yes, companies definitely do use bug tracking software, and you better get used to using some of them. I think the biggest thing that hit hard when I started in the AAA industry is the amount of debugging you have to do. At university, the games and the engines we wrote were relatively simple. If there was a problem, you could set a breakpoint on code, check a value. I think within a couple of minutes you'd figured out what was going wrong, and there we go. But some of the debugging sessions were entire overnight experiences trying to reproduce a bug that would take 2 hours to find and figure out the right place to put traps and stuff in the code to figure out what had gone wrong. I think there was an entire week that was dedicated to just debugging sessions, finding this memory trash bug that was really tricky to track down. You do so much debugging. There's a phrase somebody keeps kicking around on Twitter I see now and again, that for the amount of time you spend writing code, you'll spend twice as long debugging it, which I think was trying to stress the importance of having clear, concise code, variable names, comments, things like that. And that certainly does apply in my experience. You will spend twice as much time debugging code as writing it.
And I think even from my university days, which have probably been a few years before yours, again, we didn't cover anything like that at all. And in my experience, professional experience, from any sort of software company, I think at least writing code probably only accounts really for sort of 30% of the activity at best, probably of managing code. So I'm hoping all those people out there listening will take heed, start learning how to use Git.
Yeah, I would agree. Learn how to revert when something's gone wrong. Learn how to merge when somebody else has done something wrong too.
Matt, you worked on 13 Lego games, I think you said. Did you have a favourite out of those?
Yes, and one movie.
Oh, and one movie. Tell us about that.
Yeah, it was the Lego Batman movie. Not that Lego Batman movie. The other Lego Batman movie. I worked on the special effects system for all the explosions in there, because we rendered the film using our game technology with some modifications. I helped with some of those modifications so that we could use it to render films rather than games.
That's impressive. Is that a common thing that happens in the industry, to use a game engine to render a film?
I don't know. I don't have much to do with the TV and film industry. I didn't get to meet a lot of the people in the actual film department when we were making the Lego Batman movie either. So I'm not entirely sure. I'd like to think so. I'd like to think some of the rendering technology and certainly the skills are transferable, because there's a lot of CGI work in films now, and I would expect some of the rendering techniques are similar. I'm not 100% sure.
Of the 13 games, is there any one that's your favourite, that you liked working on the most?
Absolutely. Lego City Undercover. It was actually handled by our partner studio in another town, but there was only one engine team, so all the engine work was handled at our office, but the actual gameplay was handled at theirs. So being an engine programmer, I got my fingers in all pies there. I got to have my name in every game because at some point I would have been involved, either writing engine-specific features for that game or debugging problems when they'd gone wrong. Or just generally helping out a coder in another office approach a particular problem using our engine. So I got quite a lot of time on Lego City Undercover. It was also our very first Wii U title, so it required the entire engine porting to that just for this one game. So I got quite a lot of hands-on with Lego City Undercover. And it was Traveller's Tales' own IP, so it wasn't based on another franchise like Harry Potter or Indiana Jones or any of those. It was something they'd completely made up from scratch, which is quite a breath of fresh air when you're working with a lot of IPs. And they got to do pretty much whatever they wanted with it, and they did do whatever they wanted with it. It was absolutely fantastic. They had free creative control, and I think their skills really shined when they were allowed to do that.
Well, it sounds like Lego obviously had a huge amount of confidence in the studio to give them that kind of freedom. Now, you were with Traveller's Tales for 4.5 years, and then you moved on to another well-known software company. But before we continue and learn about that, why don't you introduce us to your next track, Matt?
Yeah, it's another Sonic one. This is going to be a Sonic-heavy playlist, by the way, I'm not sorry. This is Hydra City's own Act 2, again from Sonic 3. This one track had me booting up the cart just to enter the sound test cheat to listen to it over and over again. I was absolutely hooked on this track as a kid.
Another stunning Sonic 3 track. I'm beginning to sense a theme in your choices. No doubt you'd have loved to go work for Sega. However, your next move was with a famous Nottingham-based company. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, certainly. It was Crytek UK. They were currently working on Homefront: The Revolution, which was a sequel, but not quite to the first Homefront. They'd taken the original concept and they made it an open world game. So yeah, I got to do lots of CryEngine work there, which was fun.
So before that, they were known as Free Radical Design, and they were responsible for the Time Splitters games. Was there still much of that heritage from that period around there?
Yeah, there was certainly lots of staff still left over Free Radical days. A lot of Time Splitter related paraphernalia over the office as well. We had a Time Splitters wall with a lot of framed newspaper clippings, magazine clippings, t-shirts and posters and things from the game, which was really nice to look at while you were making your brew. They had a lot of old merch there too, which they handed out now and again. I think I've even still got some boxed and sealed games that they found in a warehouse somewhere that they handed out. So yeah, lots of Time Splitter stuff still in the office, I think. Staff and games and posters, that sort of thing.
And when you say you worked with the Crytek engine, were you actively developing the engine itself, or were you making games using the engine?
It was a bit of both. I was on the game team. I was very much interested in the lower level tech as well, so I sort of became the bridge between the engine team and the game team. So I got my hands in both. I did quite a lot of gameplay stuff there, but also a lot of engine work. So I got my fill of pretty much all of that experience.
Can you remember what games you were involved in and what sort of role you played on those projects?
Homefront: The Revolution was the only game I saw released there. I can't talk about other projects, I'm afraid. I'm still under NDA. But Homefront: The Revolution was the big one. I was a gameplay programmer and sort of semi-tech programmer, so I got to work on things like the Seeker drones in there, which are little flying drones with laser scanners that scan NPCs. to do a bit of vehicle physics work, a bit of weapons stuff, and a lot of engine side stuff as well. A lot of trying to optimize loading time, stuff like that, and the checkpoint save system. I think I did there too.
So you would have had experiences somewhat similar to me in terms of I used to, well, a few years ago, I wrote a few rendering engines, and we used to always have these really interesting effects where can't quite remember exactly what would happen, but you get to the edges of sine or cosine tan where the quadrants would flip. Did you ever see anything interesting like that happen?
We certainly saw a lot of problems to do with floating point errors when you start using floats for big numbers, especially working on an open world game where object coordinates start going out of bounds. It would be very much physics based. The physics would really misbehave as soon as you start to go out of the floating point accuracy range, things like that. I didn't have a lot to do with rendering. I tried a lot of rendering during university, and I didn't do much of it at Traveller's Tales at all, so it was about a 4 or 5 year gap before I got back onto rendering when I was at Crytek, and it was an entirely different world. I started out doing a mostly fixed function rendering with a little bit of shader work, and then by the time I'd come out the other end of TT, everything was shaders, even shaders for computations now. So it was all very different when I came out the other side, so I'd like to pick up rendering again at some point.
Just stepping away from the technical there, in your first job with Traveller's Tales, you were there for a good 4.5 years. Is it common for games programmers to remain loyal to a studio, or do they chop and change?
I think there's many answers to that. It wildly depends on the studio, the publisher, the pay, even who you are, even the programmer. I've seen coders last a year. I've seen them at studios for 20 years. It widely varies. I haven't had the mispleasure to work with a failing studio either. I know studios do get shut down quite a lot, so that certainly affects those numbers. I've been very fortunate that all mine have stayed alive.
Were you ever involved in a studio when it was taken over?
Yes, I was involved in a transition. There was a worrying time during Crytek UK's life where we thought it was all gonna be over, but it was snapped up quite quickly by the publisher that was working with us, and we switched name and logo, and everything sort of carried on as normal, which was nice.
We'd love to talk about some of the technologies you got to play with while at Dambuster, but before we do, could you introduce your next track?
Surprise, surprise, it's another Sonic track. This is Rusty Ruin Zone Act 1 from Sonic 3D Blast on the Megadrive. This game was quite a big part of my life. I received it brand new as a kid, box, and it was a game that captivated me right from the start, mostly because it was an absolute technical marvel. I remember witnessing that FMV that was streaming from cartridge on startup, the amount of colours they managed to cram into the scene, and no Sonic game is worth anything without the soundtrack, and that was absolutely superb. I remember seeing TT games on the news when I was young as well, because a British company having the Sonic license was a big deal, and I vaguely remember screens of 3D models being drawn in their office, and that contributed to my desire to become a developer very early on too. So I think Sonic 3D is a fantastic game in its own right, but gameplay wise probably not a very good Sonic game. I wonder if it would have fared better with a different IP or even a unique character rather than Sonic. But yeah, behind the scenes it really is a technical marvel, and it's got one of the best soundtracks.
That was another Mega Drive composition. Interestingly, there were different soundtracks available if you played it on the Sega Saturn or on the Mega Drive, but yours was the Mega Drive version, and we're edging slowly towards the present day and your current work on the Mega Drive. But while you were working on developing modern games at the various studios, were you enjoying retro gaming in your spare time, or were you strictly a modern gamer?
No, it was very much a bit of both. I took pride in having all my consoles set up ready to go under my TV. I bought one of these wide TV stands with individual units to put all my consoles in. I had pretty much all of them set up, everything from my NES, SNES, Master System, Mega Drive, all the PlayStations. Yeah, I had them all set up, and I played on pretty much all of them. My games catalogue was quite large, and I enjoyed games from every genre of games.
And when you're playing these games, are you able to switch your developer's brain off and just enjoy them purely as a game, or are you always analysing parts of the game?
No games developers ever allowed that luxury ever again. Always either criticising or I spot problems, glitches, bugs a little more sharply than people who don't do this for a living. It's something you can't switch off, unfortunately. I do try now and again. A game captivates me so much that I do get the luxury of just sitting and enjoying it. I think the last one to do that was Playdead's Inside. But I've played multiple runs now, and certainly after the first run, that developer brain switches back on, and then I start experimenting with physics and things like that in the game. And I don't know if anybody learns how to switch that function off in your brain. I'd love to hear from them.
So clearly you enjoyed these machines in your free time and managing a 9-to-5 job during the day. But were you starting to get itchy feet? Were you dabbling in your own projects at home?
Yeah, I always had been. As soon as I get home from work, the first thing I want to do is start working my own stuff. So I've been doing that for a very long time, across all sorts of different platforms, all sorts of different games. None of them ever really amounted to anything, except I guess the game engine I was working on, which I'm going to be using for the Dreamcast port of my own game soon. So yeah, it wasn't until I started work on Tanglewood that I had something that I really wanted to pursue right to the end and see a release. They were all just samples and experiments and bits of tech I was working on.
So do you think your home brew technology development, your own R&D, did that sort of flow into your work life, or did the things you do at work flow into your home life?
It was definitely a two-way thing. I think learning assembly language was a real eye-opener for some of my work-related stuff, especially when it came to debugging crash dumps with no source code, and you had to flick through the assembly to figure out the problem. That certainly helped. I certainly became a lot more useful when really tricky bugs came in. I think some design stuff probably crossed over as well. I was playing a lot of different genre games to the ones I was working on at work. I tried to bring the best parts of my experiences to work with me and try to add to the creative element of whatever we were working on at the time too.
So what was it then that made you want to produce your own commercial product and get it out there to market? Was there any one thing, or did it just happen kind of naturally and you thought, I have something here that I could turn into a product?
It was a culmination of many things, really. It was something I definitely wanted to do since I was a kid. I'd always wanted to make my own Mega Drive game. I'd always have dreams of seeing my own Mega Drive box on the shelf. I guess I never really grew up. I'm still a kid with that dream. It's still there. It never went away. Obviously, time and money is a different factor entirely. Actually being able to sit down and do it is another thing. There was a lot of egging on from my friends to try and do this. I'd post up little video snippets of my work in progress. Mega Drive development. I think I've still got most of those on my YouTube channel. Right back from the days where I had just a moving block on screen. Even from that early on, people were egging me on to make something of this. I think from the first time I had a character on screen, somebody shouted the word Kickstarter and said, you should really chase this up, you should really do something with this finally. So yeah, a mixture of all sorts of influences that actually got me to actually press the button and do it, but I'm glad they did.
So we're about to sort of enter a new milestone in your life, but just before we roll into Tanglewood and your Kickstarter experience, could you please introduce your next track?
It's the massive Daytona USA's Let's Go Away. I don't think I owned a Daytona game on any home console. This was purely an arcade experience for me. I just don't think an arcade was worth anything unless you could hear this vaguely blasting from a corner of the room somewhere. It reminds me of my camping holidays down in Barmouth in England, which is where I got my first taste of games like Sega Rally, Golden Axe. I think it was my first experience playing on a Paperboy upright arcade with the bike handlebars too. So yeah, we didn't have many arcades around where I lived, so my holidays with family were my opportunities to wander off to arcades down there. But yeah, every arcade I walked into, you could hear that Daytona chant somewhere in the corner. And to me, it's the soundtrack of the arcade.
I was reading something earlier about someone who worked in an arcade as a sort of, in their early 20s, and they just said they absolutely hated that song. Because you're right, you can always hear it, can't you? Daytona.
Yeah, there's certainly many clips that used to wake me up in the middle of the night and they'd be rolling around my head. I remember we had this audio test for surround sound. We had 5.1 surround sound system in progress that we're trying to perfect. And it was just this guy on mic going left, right, centre, left, back, right, back, bass, and all over again, left, right, centre. It's just again and again we had to listen to this the snippet to try and get volumes right and routing right and things like that. And yeah, that clip was rolling around my head for a good few years.
I was just going to say, I went into a modern arcade recently, or an arcade, and I was so disappointed because the first thing I saw was a Flappy Bird arcade, and the arcade machine is now in a great big portrait aspect, but not like an old school shoot 'em up. This is like a 4-foot portrait screen that's made to look like an Android phone. Have you been in a modern arcade recently and suffered that same disappointment?
Isn't that a bit fourth wall breaking? Don't we go to arcades to try and relive our childhoods? A big Android-shaped Flappy Bird clone just rips us back to reality.
No, but maybe it is like, for these youngsters now, that's what it is. Oh, do you remember those Nexus 7s? Yeah. That's the earliest they go. So it's about this time you decided to make your own mark on the games world. Tell us a little bit about the exact point you flicked the switch and made your life about Tanglewood.
If you mean pressing the start button on the Kickstarter, that took a couple of hours working up to try and press the button. I'd spent months perfecting the Kickstarter page, working out all the little details, the tiers and things like that. I had many people review it, and even on the day I was supposed to press the button, I had to down a whole bottle of whiskey to pluck up the courage to actually do this.
Wow. Were you still employed at the time?
Yeah, I was. My employer were very, very excited about it too. They were certainly very supportive.
Oh, so you didn't sort of decide that we'll see how the Kickstarter pans out before telling employers and things like that? They already knew.
No. I was very upfront about the whole thing. And they were super supportive. I was really happy with how they handled that. They said, obviously, if it's a success, they'll be sad to see me go. But if it doesn't make it, you've always got a home here, that sort of thing. So And if you ever find a studio like that, hold on to them. It's such a nice place to be. So yeah, it took a couple of hours to work up the courage to press that button, knowing that it would either fulfill my dream, which means, damn, I've actually got to go through with this now and make the damn thing, or it would be a lifelong dream crushing moment where it failed, where the venture I'd been pursuing since I was 9 years old would all come to a sudden halt. So yeah, it was quite a big moment.
But you drank your bottle of whiskey and you built up the courage and you hit that button. What happened? Was it an immediate influx of millions of pounds, or was it a slow and steady Kickstarter for you?
It was very confusing because I clicked the button and I got a confirmation email through from Kickstarter saying your project's now live, and then the phone wouldn't stop. It was ding, 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 ding. I didn't know what was going on. I thought something had gone wrong. I couldn't believe people were so quick to jump on those sort of things. I hadn't even announced it on my social media yet, so I didn't know if people just sit there refreshing the Kickstarter homepage to see what's new, or if there's some sort of algorithm that was sending the link out based on certain keywords. But people were on it so fast that I didn't understand. I hadn't even done my PR campaign yet. So yeah, the word spread very quickly, and I think within 24 hours is on major gaming news sites that someone's making a brand new Megadrive game that was going to be on cartridge. It was just unreal, absolutely unreal. I wonder to this day, if I hadn't started my PR campaign entirely, I still reckon I could have made it. With the amount of noise that was going on off the back of this Kickstarter, just on its own, just of its own natural flow, was just unreal. It was a really confusing thing to watch.
So, Matt, for those of us who haven't managed to glean what Tanglewood is yet, could you please let us know?
It's a 2D platforming game for the Sega Megadrive. It stars this little character called Nim, who's a very scared fox, and he doesn't like being out after dark, because that's when all the monsters come out. So the game starts really friendly, it's all in daytime and you get to run around with Nim, and then nighttime falls and he can't get back home. So then he has to deal with monsters of the forest coming out, and he has to defeat them with tricks and traps or just pure evasion, things like that. When I describe the game, there's bits I'm deliberately vague on. There's quite a lot hidden that I haven't revealed yet. I've been trying to keep secret until release day. So when I say there's more to it than that, I really do mean there's more to it than that. I compare it to other games as well to sort of help put it in your mind. If you played things like Another World, Flashback as well, that sort of style of moment to moment story based gameplay. There's bits of other platformers like The Lion King in there, some Abe's Odyssey, and there's some influences from modern titles like Limbo and Inside as well.
The first game that came into my mind when I saw Tanglewood was The Lion King, and the graphics and the quality of the animation are certainly up there with that game. Did you do the art, or did you have some assistance with that?
There were 2 or 3 artists on the project. The first one, who did the character design, wanted to be a Disney animator for a living, so if you think there's some Lion King influence from there, then yeah, there definitely is some Lion King influence there. And a composer, goes by the name of Freeze Dream. He released his own album on cartridge a few years ago, so he certainly knows what he's doing with the Megadrive, and he's done an amazing job with the soundtrack too. So yeah, for the best part of 6 years, it's been mostly a one-man job, but there's been 6 months to a year of these contractors chipping in, filling out all the bits I can't do.
Despite all the modern tools available to use today, you chose to use an original Megadrive development kit. How did you get hold of one?
Well, that's a very long answer. It took several years to try and get hold of the pieces from that. I scoured sites like eBay. There was a forum called Assembler Games, which is known for getting hold of rare hardware. It didn't all come in one piece. I had the main unit from one place. The discs and manuals came from Australia. Also giant chunky ISA cards that go into an MS-DOS based PC, and they came from elsewhere. One of the hardest parts to track down was the actual cables to fit it all together. Yeah, so it took between a year and 2 years to try and get hold of all the pieces for it.
I haven't seen a Mega Drive development kit, so can you just describe it for us? It sounds like it's a combination of a PC and is it a Mega Drive style unit next to it, or is it all built into the PC?
It's the particular one I'm using at the moment is a Cross Products Mega CD development kit. So it looks like an all-in-one Mega Drive and Mega CD, but the 2 parts aren't separable. They're molded together. It's got a lot of jumpers and lights and switches on the front of the panel to configure it in various modes. And that all attaches via a SCSI cable to I'm running a Windows 95 PC at the moment. I think it's a 200 megahertz machine, and all the software is MS-DOS based. The IDE, the debugger, things like that, the assembler.
So, Matt, did you have any trouble obtaining dongles or licenses or bits of software as well as the hardware?
Yeah, all of the above. The dongle's built into one of the ISA cards that connects to the dev kit. It's a little what looks like a watch battery. The ISA card's got 4 slots in for 4 various licenses, which is a really cool design, I think. If you've ever used something like Cubase back in the day, which used to come with the parallel port dongles, it serves a similar purpose. The software is tricky to obtain as well. That came separately too. I did manage to find original discs though, so I'm quite pleased with that.
Do you feel the players will be able to feel that when they're playing the game, that it's been actually developed in that way?
I certainly hope they'll feel it when they open the box for the first time. That's something we've been very careful about, is choosing the right plastic for our moulds for the cartridges, the cases. The feel of everything, the weight of everything has to be right, right down to the smell of the manual. Whether or not you'll know how it was developed by playing the game is unlikely, apart from the fact I hope it's pretty performant because it's written in assembly rather than a higher level language.
Now, the project obviously got a lot of publicity. At any point, did Sega contact you and pass any comment?
Yes, they did. I tried contacting their legal department some years ago to ask if I could get this thing officially licensed. Unfortunately, but not unexpectedly, they said no. They don't have the departments to deal with a Megadrive release anymore, which is a shame, but they didn't send me a cease and desist, which I'd have expected from other companies, and they unofficially wished me good luck with it, but nothing official, unfortunately.
Matt, it must have been heartening to have got that feedback from Sega. Do you think it would have been the same if you'd chosen to go with Nintendo for your game?
I'm not entirely sure. I've looked at a few titles that went too close to the edge, if you know what I mean, and had their cease and desist letters through, and it was almost always Nintendo that was sending those. I think their lawyers are a bit trigger happy on stuff like that. I get it and I don't. They've got IPs to protect. They have to be really careful about what they allow into the world. But of all the cases I've seen, these people were very blatantly ripping off somebody else's work, and that's not what I'm about. That's not what I'm out to do. This is all my original IP. All the code is mine. All the artwork was done by us. It's very much an original title in its own right.
Just before we go deep into Tanglewood coding secrets, why don't you introduce your next track?
Yeah, this is Streets of Rage 2, a little unheard of title for the Megadrive. The track's called Never Return Alive. I didn't actually own Streets of Rage 2 as a kid. This was another game that was owned by all of my friends, so wherever I went, whoever's house I went to, there was always Streets of Rage 2 to play. I've only ever finished the game co-op, which was quite a nice experience. That's something I probably don't want to change.
The brilliant Streets of Rage 2 there with Never Return Alive, which was a real iconic series. When it came to the genre of game that you wanted to program, Matt, you settled on the side-scrolling platform style, although you've hinted that it's a little bit more than that. Why do you think it was that you went with that style and not a shoot 'em up, for example?
Platformers have been my favourite games growing up remain my favourite genre today, largely influenced by titles like the Abe's Odyssey series, Heart of Darkness on the PS1, all the way back to games like Flashback, I guess even the Sonic games are in there. Most of the Disney titles, actually, the Disney titles were absolute gold, and they were almost always platformers too. So yeah, platformers are very, very true to my heart.
Well, you've chosen what type of game you want to make, and you've got your dev kit all set up, and you've planned out the game. So you've sat down on day one, ready to write a new game from scratch. Did you correctly anticipate the amount of work, do you think, that was ahead of you and that you needed to complete the project?
Absolutely not, no. You can still view my very first line of assembly code ever, if you look in the right place. It was a question I was asking on a forum because I couldn't get even the simplest line of code to assemble. I was trying to figure out assembly flags and set up my environment and things like that to try and get it to assemble. And that post is still there. I had it in a bookmark at one point to remind myself of where I started. And it was a very slow process, but something I had to stick at every day to try and learn how to do even the basic things like add two numbers together. Even though I'd already had 10 plus years of experience in the AAA industry, sitting down to do something like this from scratch was still quite a struggle. So eventually I got things like text routines on screen. I managed to write Hello World, and that took weeks to figure out. After that I had things like blocks walking around on screen, stuff like that. I had some basic collision in place. So yeah, it was a huge effort, and it's taken 6 years to get to this point, from starting my very first line of assembly code to having the game nearly ready to go. And it was a constant uphill struggle for the whole time.
But do you now feel that you're completely au fait with it? Do you dream in assembly language now?
Yeah, it certainly comes a lot more fluent now. I've started experimenting with writing a few new samples completely from scratch, because obviously if I look through some of the old code that I used to write, it's absolutely horrific, and I won't be bringing everything across to the next engine I write. So yeah, I'm certainly a lot better at it now. It certainly comes a lot more fluently. But at least I know where to start with a particular problem now, and learning where to start solving something it is one of the hardest things to do.
When you're implementing, say, a new game engine, possibly on another system that's not using that processor, are you going to be using an emulator of that chip so that you can just continue to code in the same way?
Yeah, there's two ways we're approaching it. For the PC version of the game, Mac and Linux as well, we've got an emulator that sort of encapsulates the game. There's a few bits of work that are offloaded to the system on its own. For the most part, yeah, it's emulating instructions. For the Dreamcast port, though, we are rewriting the game code in C++ using an engine I've already developed for the Dreamcast.
From slow beginnings, Matt, after a 6-year slog, you finally got to the point, I think just last week, was it, where you went gold?
Yes, indeed. The QA team we've hired sent me a very nice email saying they've signed it off and they're happy for this version to be released, which is an absolute amazing moment. Considering this has taken nearly 6 years to get to this point, it's quite a breath of fresh air to receive an email like that.
Yeah, well, first of all, congratulations. That's obviously a huge achievement. Right until the end, were there still more features that you thought, I could just add this, I could just add that? Did you have to draw the line somewhere and force yourself to stop?
Yeah, certainly have to. Obviously, I want the best game that I can come up with. I want every last feature I can get crammed into there. It's sort of a curse and a blessing being an indie developer running on my own time, because I could just have done this forever. I could continue development until the end of time, making tweaks, adding new features, fixing tiny, minuscule things like pixels out of place, stuff like that. If I ever want to see it released, I have to have the balls to say this is enough. We've got to stop it now. We've got to release it.
So you went gold, and now it's time to deliver the product to the customers, Matt. But I understand you had a small problem taking delivery of a crate in your front garden. Is that right?
Yes, indeed. For the first batch, we're going to be delivering 1,000 cartridges. But yeah, I had ordered 1,000 cardboard boxes to ship the games in, expecting them to be delivered on separate packages. They delivered the whole thing on one giant crate one Saturday morning. This forklift rolled up and dropped it on my lawn. I had no idea what to do with it. So yeah, that certainly wouldn't fit through the door. So I had to spend all morning dissecting the package and taking it all through the house in separate bits.
Matt, you may not want to think about this just yet, but is it too early to ask what the next project might be?
No, certainly not too early. We already have a design together for the next game. This has been a real fun experience, and it's not something I want to stop anytime soon, even with the release of this game. So yes, we definitely have another game in the works that we're going to start development very soon.
And where might we have to go to keep an eye on that?
Keep an eye on our Twitter, big_evil_corp. There won't be an announcement anytime soon, but that's where it'll be when it happens.
Matt, you now have 2 important decisions to make before we leave you on Retro Island. You can pick only one of the 8 tracks you've shared with us today to keep you company. Which will it be?
The one with the heaviest bass line, that's got to be Toe Jamming Now.
And you can also pick one game or application to enjoy on Retro Island, the only condition being that it has no internet connectivity. What would you like to take with you?
Ooh, I guess I'm going to go the interesting route of some sort of development tool so I can make my own stuff. How about that? Visual Studio. I would take Visual Studio with me. I can write whatever other software I wanted.
I think he's found a flaw in our system here, Andrew.
I certainly have, yes.
Well, not really, Neil, because we're like the overlords here, the evil overlords. We'll say yes, but you can only have Visual Fox Pro.
Oh dear, no deal. Absolutely not.
My caveat is you can't save anything.
Oh.
And the power supply on the island is known to be twitchy.
I don't like this game.
So, Matt, it's been wonderful chatting to you here on the Retro Island Pier, but soon we'll have to push off and head back to the mainland. We hope you've enjoyed your time as much as we have.
Yes, certainly have. It's been lots of fun.
Thank you so much, Matt. And if you enjoyed the show today, why not take a moment to check out the other episodes of our podcast? Or you can find more retro goodness on my YouTube channel, RetroManCave.
And you can find me on the YouTube channel BackOfficeShow. You'll find links in the show notes, as well as links to Matt's choices and, of course, Tanglewood. Thank you for listening, and until next time, goodbye.